Always a tough act to follow, whether on time or ahead of time. Jake Bleacher, thanks, folks. So, as next slide, please. Try to go over some of the things, architecture strategy. So, Jake talked about some of the integration across directorates and some of the Moon to Mars objectives overall for the strategy and the architecture. What we want to do is take this iteration and evolve that through annual architecture concept reviews. Within that, in the goals and objectives, we try to take into account the recurring tenants and the different focus areas that are listed there, and then evolve that architecture. So it's a little different than what you've seen in the past, say with Constellation or other large architecture systems, where we've laid out everything, looking forward 20 plus years. In this strategy and what we're approaching now is we're looking at the functions, how we would use an architecture. And so we're using terminology from systems engineering and trying to use some of those processes, but we're using them in a slightly different way to approach a system of systems approach and a systems architecture approach. And so instead of the solution, we're trying to look at and develop use cases and functions and develop concepts that can accomplish those objectives over the course of the upcoming years. Next slide, please. So one of the ways we do this is architecting from the right. So this is something you may have heard, and what we really want to do is look at the different end states that could potentially be out there, different target states, and then look at how do we backtrack that to the existing systems. This is an iterative process. As we know, technology is maturing, different constraints are there, but what we want to provide is a framework that's traceable. It's existence for the overall architecture, taking into account multiple aspects, and then document these in processes and products that some of which are available to the public via architecture definition document, the ADD, as well as white papers, as well as interaction with the team here through the forms of workshops and or forums like this. And so as you see here, it looks linear, but towards the right, we're doing this annual cycle where we come back, go across with the agency and confirm that the architecture is indeed progressing and meeting the objectives and working towards satisfaction and increasing that satisfaction as Jake indicated. Next slide, please. So once the decomposition happens, you're probably wondering, well, how are you doing this? At a high level, it's a traditional approach of looking at the goals and objectives and then taking that down and trying to figure out what those characteristics and needs are. So taking it a level deeper, saying, what does this actually mean? And then breaking it down one more level and going to use cases and functions. Use case would be not how an element or a particular item would be used, but how would the architecture itself or a series of elements be used to accomplish a specific function. This could be identified by a domain such as the lunar surface or in cislunar space, or it could be broader than that. On the left, you'll see design reference and conceptual reference submissions and ConOps, and then requirements and elements. So we're working with the implementing organizations. So these are the teams that actually are building the hardware in the Moon to Mars team, executing the Artemis campaign. So we're working with them directly to make sure that these are aligned, making sure we're not adding complexity and or capabilities that aren't currently in existence and or would cause perturbations to existing timelines. And so we're looking forward as well as making sure that we integrate in the middle with the organizations and systems that are being deployed now. One of the keys for this, if you go to the next slide, is to be able to show traceability. Decomposition of objectives. So you can actually take a look at this and see this. The Rev A of the ADD has content that shows these use cases and functions, as well as the decomposition of the characteristics and needs at the QR code there. And it talks about the architecture at a high level. and then breaks down the characteristics and needs, use cases, and functions that are currently attributed. Now, as mentioned, this is an iterative process. So every year we're conducting trades internally as well as with partners in industry as well across to define and refine some of these areas. So some of these functions and use cases do update, do change. They are fairly stable now that we're working on our third set and updates now. But it gives you an idea of the mapping, the type of work we're looking at, and how we tie these things with other elements. Next slide, please. One of the ultimate goals of this is to show how the objectives at the agency level then flow down through the use cases down into actual requirements and ConOps at the program level. So we're working in different environments, looking at model-based systems engineering tools to help us make this trace to ensure that the concepts that we're developing are handed off in a good manner, that they're feasible, and that they trace to real requirements and that the project teams can actually execute those. Some of the things that Jake mentioned that we're trying to do work across directorates at an early level and early in the process to be able to ensure that the capabilities that are needed can actually be employed into the systems and those elements early in the concept phase. So that way, once they're in the execution and implementation phase, that we have that capability on the system, or we know what type of capabilities to trade as we try to make that a reality. Next slide. This shows us a broader view of the architecture. On the left are the segments. We can't necessarily accomplish everything that we want to do in one shot. We've got political, budgetary pressures, technological advancements we need to make. So we've broken these up into the human lunar return, which is more of the near term, foundational exploration, where we're going to go ahead and try to expand our footprint on the lunar surface and get our foundational exploration established, and then sustained lunar evolution and how we get to a much larger scale approach and or footprint on the moon that could include both scientific, commercial, and Mars analog missions to get us ready for the one of the future segments, the human to Mars. And so we work with our Mars team to make sure that the work that we're doing on the lunar surface enables and informs work for Mars and aligns with what they're doing as well. Architecture is further broken up into sub-architectures in order to break down the large problem that we have. These are the 12 are shown there, which I won't go into in detail. And then those sub-architectures would potentially be assigned an element that accomplishes a major portion of that architecture. Some of the elements you'll be familiar with, such as Gateway, HLS, Orion, and then others maybe a little bit more in the background, such as the scan networks that support our NSN and DSN. Next slide, please. So we have a pre-formulation process that we're implementing. We look at our Moon to Mars objective on the left. We go through some trades and analysis, look at the gaps that are there, which functions are not allocated to existing systems. And we do studies both, as I mentioned, with partners, with industry, even potentially with academia. And then we decide whether or not we want to conduct an element initiation. If we do conduct that, then we continue the studies, mature this, and move towards a mission concept review and develop an acquisition plan or strategy, and then move to implementation agreements or RFPs. So at a high level, this is the process that the agency wants to do as we implement a large element or a new element into the system that helps us accomplish multiple objectives and close multiple functional gaps within the architecture. This process is relatively new. We've gone through it a couple of times, so there'll be updates to this and refinements as with any good process as we move forward. Next slide, please. So coming out of that process that we talked about, we're looking at the gaps in the architecture, doing trades and analysis. Two new white papers were released a couple of months ago dealing with lunar surface cargo and lunar mobility drivers and needs. You can read the white papers there, as well as some of our other documentation and some of our previous white papers from the past couple of years. Basically indicating we do have a gap in how we're going to get the amount of cargo to the surface and how are we going to move that. The ranges that are there and the details that are needed to support two crew or four crew for multiple days on the surface, as well as making sure we're able to move their habitats, move the equipment that they need, and move them on the surface, are captured at a high level in the needs in these two white papers. Next slide, please. I mentioned the architecture workshops. We are changing the process, and over the past couple of years, we've conducted industry and academia workshops, as well as international partner workshops. These yearly workshops are intended to be a more direct way for the public to engage with us in specific industries or international partners. You can subscribe for updates at the QR code shown there and get more information on when and where these are conducted. They're generally in February, scheduled for this year, this coming year as well. And then we'll have information on the updates to the ADD, as well as panels and other speakers from across directorates, and allow for some panel sessions, allowing us to go back and forth and have an open dialogue with everyone that's in attendance. Next slide. Again, just another pitch for our architecture products. This is a change in the way the agency's operated. A lot of times the technical content was hidden on NTRS. This is out there in the public with a relatively easy website. And the QR code there has the white papers, has the revision A of the documents, as well as others, and then allows for easy reading if you like on the white papers, a little bit more in depth in the ADD, and then allowing you to ask questions or dig into details and see what you'd like to discuss. Next slide, please. Shifting gears a little bit more towards the left, the recent Artemis progress. So a lot of pictures here. Jake already mentioned Artemis 2 crew there. You see a lot of the development there, such as the core stage, stacking of the boosters, some of the test firing of the engines, some work going on for surface operations in the NBL, the Starship, which obviously is our HLS lander in disguise, and Orion development and testing going on at the Cape. So there's a lot of work going on, and some of the rover work that Jake mentioned, both with LTV and pressurized rover as well. So lots of development, lots of conceptual work, but this is the real hardware that the crew will be using, and we will all be hopeful to watch launch in the coming year. Next slide. And the core stage rollout. So it's just an amazing picture to see that coming out of the Michoud assembly facility there and making its way to KSC. So that is the Artemis 2 core stage for SLS. So definitely inspiring for all of us to know that this is becoming more and more real, and the return to the lunar orbit for us is just around the corner. So that is my last slide. I believe the next one is for questions. So I tried to buy you back about a minute or so there, Brad.
Thanks, Shatel. It's always a pleasure seeing that, and what a fantastic photo of seeing the core stage roll out. That's just amazing. Thank you for that presentation, and we'll take questions for Shatel at the end with everyone else.